Hello dear viewers of my channel, this is a very interesting video, so I recommend watching it until the end. Before I start, I want to thank the channel's sponsors, as well as the subscribers who write comments. Thank you guys. I wish everyone a pleasant viewing. The main character's father was in chains, and just a meter away from him was a blade ready to finish him off at any moment, while the main character himself, whose name was Leon, stood nearby, his gaze completely empty and broken, feeling as disgusting as possible. His father stared silently at the floor while his head was in the stocks. The people who had gathered did not understand what the man had done, because he was not guilty, but they were afraid to say anything openly, because they could be next in line for execution. While the Lord sat proudly in his seat and watched, one of the men in the crowd said that they simply couldn't do anything, only watch all this horror unfold. It turned out that a huge crowd had gathered to watch the execution, and crows flew across the sky, foreshadowing something terrible. It turned out that it was a time of war and strife, in which countless conflicts arose. It was in this way that the main character's family was to become the last victim in this conflict. The man kept his tortured eyes open, then closed them in anticipation of his imminent death. While the strong had everything they could ever want, the weak had to steal and fight for their lives every day. People looked in horror at the scene where the main character's father stood, silently staring at the floor, showing no emotion whatsoever. The Lord looked intently at the place of execution, after which a devilish smile appeared on his face. He seemed incredibly happy, and he himself was the head of the Sylvestre family, which was a rival of the Marvas family. The man shouted for the spectacle to begin, and people continued to whisper among themselves while Leon stood next to his father. The Lord began to complain that the main character had not followed his direct order to proceed with the execution, while Leon grabbed the knife in his hands and began to hold the weapon very tightly. He then approached the rope that would trigger the mechanism that would sever his father's head from his shoulders. The Lord shouted at the main character not to delay and finally cut the rope, after which Leon began to approach even closer. He saw the rope he was supposed to cut and the body of his father, after which Leon, with a completely blank look, prepared to cut the rope, under the excited glances of all the common people and the delight in the eyes of the Lord, who seemed to have planned it all. The main character finally cut the rope, after which the guillotine fell and cut the man's throat. Blood began to fly towards the main character, who had just killed his beloved father with his own hands. The guy just stared down with an empty gaze, looking as if he was in terrible pain. Leon looked at his hands, which were stained with blood, realizing that from that moment on, everything would be different. Now the young man had an incredible burden on his shoulders. The main character looked at his reflection in the pool of blood, thinking that he had personally killed his father. The man's head lay on the ground, and for him, at that very moment, everything was over forever. The main character stood with drops of his father's blood on his face. He thought about how he had become the man who had carried out the sentence against his father. The head of the family is a representative of his noble lineage. As the name suggests, these people are not ordinary aristocrats, but true pillars of the entire nation. But the truth was that it was difficult to bear such responsibility. Such a burden should only fall on a strong person who could cope with its weight. Leon sat among a huge number of his followers, and from that moment on, the main character became the head of his clan. One of the men began to shout that the Sylvestre's power was growing too fast and that they would soon be drawn into a war with them and lose. The fat man asked his leader to strengthen their forces, while another man shouted that Leon should make a decision as soon as possible. The old man also turned to Leon and said that he should give a wise answer. The main character ordered everyone to stop the commotion at the meeting. Leon began to rise from his seat, saying that everyone should be patient until he made a decision. The man said that this matter could not be delayed. In the end, the main character left the council chamber. Leon walked down the corridor, thinking about his own life. He thought about how, after his father's death, he had to take on the role of head of his house at the age of 14. In the past, his house had been an incredibly powerful house of necromancers, but now it had lost all its power and glory. Leon looked at the portraits hanging on the wall and thought about his mother and father, who were depicted in them. The main character mentally asked them what they would have done if they were in his place. Leon continued on, realizing that he would not get the answer he so desperately needed. He stood near the huge doors, thinking about how to restore power and glory to his house. The boy looked at the doors with a cold gaze and saw a cheerful painting depicting Leon von Marvas, the main character, standing and thinking that this man was the progenitor of their house and also the only necromancer of his era. The main character thought about how their founder had gained glory on the front lines. But even with him, there was not a single worthy necromancer in their house, which was why their house had fallen into such disrepair. Leon sighed in disappointment and began to open the doors, thinking that their family had fallen so far that he personally had to kill his father. Leon entered an incredibly beautiful room and headed toward a book. It turned out to be the chronicles of their house. Their founder was an incredible legend, capable of sweeping away all his enemies with a single movement of his hand. He also summoned a huge number of dead people who moved in a huge march. He personally subjugated the western regions in just a few months. There were also rumors that the founder had made a deal with a demon and was able to obtain the greatest secret. And the most secret was a book that was the secret of necromancy. The main character looked at this book, thinking that it was thanks to it that the founder had become so powerful. Leon thought that this book was the most valuable artifact in his family, passed down from one head to the next, and he also thought that it was thanks to it that the founder had gained such power. The main character grabbed the book and began to leaf through it, when suddenly he heard a terrifying voice calling out to him. Leon did not understand what was happening, because it was unlikely that telepathy could be used in this room. The main character asked who was calling him, and the creature said in a terrifying voice that it was not Leon's enemy, but Leon did not seem willing to trust an unknown creature so easily. Suddenly, a magic circle appeared near Leon and began to emit a huge amount of energy. The guy suddenly covered his eyes, then opened them and began to look ahead. In front of Leon was an incredibly huge lion, which was only a few centimeters away from him and was staring intently. Leon asked what this place was, while the demon was amazed that the previous chapter had not even bothered to mention it. The demon also began to talk about how he felt that the thread connecting him and the main character's father had been broken. The demon was beside himself with rage, shouting that he had not worried about the man, who was too kind for the head of the clan, for nothing. The demon asked the main character who exactly was responsible for his father's death. At that moment, the young man looked at the demon and began to say that he would reveal who had killed his father. Leon declared that he, the son, had killed his father with his own hands. This instantly caused a storm of anger in the demon. It seemed that he did not like this at all. The demon decided to ask the main character again, after which he began to shout, asking if it was true that Leon had killed the former head of the clan. The main character said that it was indeed him, then looked at the demon with an incredibly cold gaze. The demon's eyes were filled with the incredible rage he felt upon hearing these words, after which the lion began to scream with all his might, creating incredible pressure. Leon stood silently watching what was happening, when suddenly memories of his father's death began to appear in his mind, how he saw his father's body and how he was devastated by the loss he had experienced. Suddenly, the demon calmed down and said that Leon had not finished what he was saying, because in fact he was not the murderer of the former leader. Leon believed that this was not true, and that he was the one who had killed his father. The demon looked at the guy and didn't know what to say to him. He wondered whether he should ignore Leon's despair, because he could sense an incredibly strong aura hidden within the main character's body. He looked at the main character, unable to comprehend how a simple human being could possess such enormous magical power. Meanwhile, Leon moved slightly from his spot, standing on a huge pool of blood with a large number of human corpses beneath him, exuding a terrible aura. The demon was amazed by what he saw when he looked at Leon. He thought that the guy was capable of even surpassing his ancestor, who was the greatest fighter in the past. Unexpectedly, the demon's character became completely gentle, after which he decided to introduce himself. His name was Marvas, and he was one of the 72 demons of hell. He had also turned away from the demonic world and decided to coexist with humans. He also introduced himself as a loyal friend of the founder and the one who had given him knowledge of necromancy. Leon admitted that legends had been written about the demon, and he also knew that it was the demon who had taught their founder the art of necromancy. The demon confessed that it was him, adding that although he was now weak, in the past he had been an incredibly terrifying creature. The main character began by saying that their ancestor often said that necromancy was in their blood. The lion listened very carefully to what Leon had to say, while the main character became incredibly serious, after which he asked with a very cold look why the demon had ultimately left them. Marvas seemed not to understand the main character's opinion and asked why the guy thought so, while Leon said that after the Lord, no one had been able to reach his level in necromancy. Marvas listened carefully and thought about the main character's words, then said that he was going to explain one simple thing. He began to explain that the reason the family members couldn't master necromancy was because their vessel was too weak. The main character didn't get it, wondering who had a suitable vessel. The demon said that no one else could have even a small part of the talent that their ancestor possessed, which was why their house was in such a deplorable state. The main character thought about the demon's words, then admitted that he trusted Marva's words. The main character admitted that this was logical for weaklings who suffered defeat after defeat in wars. The demon asked Leon if this was why he had so easily accepted his father's death, to which the main character replied that it didn't matter now and added that there was nothing special about his father's death. Unexpectedly, Leon thought about something, after which he decided to ask the demon for one last favor. Unexpectedly, Marvas said that he would not grant the favor and began to explain that the favor involved one of the participants being left with nothing, and that the agreement with demons worked a little differently. The main character said that even so, he would like to discuss the power of a necromancer. The demon looked intently at the young man, waiting for him to speak, while Leon himself asked if the demon was capable of granting the power of a necromancer. The demon turned away, saying that he did not understand what was so special about the young man that he wanted a demon to personally grant him power. Marvas looked at the hero, wondering if the guy really believed he had the potential to develop these powers. Meanwhile, the main character confidently stated that he had the necessary potential, adding that if things were different, the demon wouldn't even be talking to him. The main character began to talk about how an ordinary person instantly loses their mana after talking to a demon, after which they fall into an illusion where they die. The main character decided that since he was still alive, he must have at least a little bit of potential. The demon thought about how the main character had an incredible mind, after which the demon wanted to remind him of the agreement, but the hero interrupted him, saying that he understood that it would be a deal. Leon began to talk about how he wasn't stupid enough to believe that he could offer the demon something in return. Unexpectedly, the demon was surprised by these words and froze in place, then began to laugh loudly. The demon said that the guy was saying excellent things and suggested that they proceed with the deal. The main character asked what Marvas would ultimately demand of him. The demon smiled, then declared with a terrifying expression that he would demand every last bit of the hero's essence. Leon listened carefully to these words, then declared with a mad expression that he was glad to hear that his essence was still worth something. The demon did not seem to expect to hear such words from the young man, while at the same time, high-ranking members of the family were sitting in the office where the meeting was taking place. Suddenly, the old man broke the silence and began talking about the current head of their family, namely the main character. The old man, with a grim expression on his face, said that Leon had too much power to make decisions that greatly affected their family. It seemed that the other members of the council silently agreed with the man's statement, but suddenly the old man said that he was Leon's uncle and that from now on, he would make all decisions concerning the future of this place. One of the people said that it would be foolish not to agree to this proposal, because they could not trust an immature puppy, adding that they simply could not leave their fate in the hands of a naive child. He said that only the uncle was the most worthy person to be the head of the family. The fat man began to say that only Leon was the direct heir to the house, and they simply could not do such a thing. The fat man declared that, in their family, it had never happened that someone who was not the direct heir became the head. The man began to look crazy, saying that they should not concern themselves with this matter, because the future of their clan was at stake. He said that the enemy army would soon be at their doorstep. The man began to say that if they chose the child as their leader, it would condemn them all to certain death. The fat man slammed his fist on the table and started shouting that their place at this table had been given to them by the previous head, and that they simply had no right to do this to the heir. The fat man thought that he simply could not stand by and watch as the main character's uncle tried to seize all the power in the family. In fact, the fat man was worried, not knowing how to resolve the issue. Suddenly, the uncle began to get to his feet, saying that it was a very amusing opinion. The uncle was also surprised that their current head had only one loyal subject. The fat man asked his uncle to speak frankly about what he meant by those words. The old man said that people like the fat man lacked insight, and then, with a grim look, said that the man simply did not notice when trouble was brewing around him. After these words, the old man began to move toward the fat man, turned to his loyal man, put his hand on his shoulder, and said that the man should listen very carefully to the wisdom he was about to impart. The uncle began to use magic on his hand, then looked horrified that the man really believed that everyone had been gathered because the old man cared about their opinion. The man was amazed that the uncle had planned everything long ago, while the old man warned the man to think about his words, at least for the sake of his family. The old man began to talk about how they had all gathered for a single purpose, saying that they had to make a difficult choice for the lesser evil for this house. The old man warned the man not to interfere with them, because in the end, they would still rule the family. The fat man realized that he was just a pawn in this game and could not influence anything. At that moment, the main character stood directly in front of the demon and began to stare intently at Marvas. The demon said that everything was just fine, except for one thing, which seemed to surprise Leon. The demon began to talk about how the change made by the main character would greatly reduce the demon's source of power. The demon also said that although the main character's father was naive and kind, he had a much larger supply of mana than the main character currently had. The main character remembered that any demon who made a deal had to drink the blood of the contractor in order to replenish their own strength. Leon asked what he would have to do in the end, while the demon snapped his fingers and said that they would spare the main character's mana for now, after which a clump of mana appeared right in front of Leon. Unexpectedly, the demon completely changed his appearance, saying that it would be difficult for him to maintain his true form. The main character looked at the tiny creature and said that it was amazing. Leon also suddenly realized that Marvas in this form was charming enough to pass for a pet. The demon, with an evil expression on his face, declared that if Leon called him charming one more time, he would tear the guy's face apart with his claws. The main character said that would be very unpleasant, and the demon said that since they understood each other, they should move on, leaving Leon wondering where exactly they should go. The demon asked Leon if he wanted to gain power comparable to that of his ancestor, and the answer was obvious. The demon said that to do this, they should follow the example of his ancestor to the letter. The main character thought about these words, thinking that they sounded logical. Suddenly, the surroundings began to change right in front of the main character. Marvas announced that they were going to a dangerous place where they would have to risk their lives. The main character was surprised that the demon really thought he would change his mind. The demon seemed completely satisfied with this answer, after which he began to move, warning Leon not to lag behind him. Sometime later, they found themselves in the forest, and the main character was struck by the mysterious forest. The demon explained that such a forest could be an impenetrable labyrinth for those who did not belong to the bloodline. The main character remembered his father's words that only the head of the clan could enter these lands, although he did not understand why his predecessors had been unable to obtain the power of a necromancer. The demon said that no one had ever passed the test and that they had been unable to meet the conditions. He said that only those with the purest attribute of darkness could reach the desired place. The demon raised his paw, then said that there was no need for further words and added that it was time to begin the trial. The main character and the demon entered a building, and the boy began to move inside. The walls of the building indicated that it was incredibly old. The demon said that from that moment on, he would not help, but Leon did not seem to mind. The demon decided to give one last hint, then said that Leon would need to follow the instructions in the book. The book glowed bright purple, and the demon said that this book would lead Leon to his desired reward, namely power. At this point, even the floor looked incredibly strange. While Leon continued to move toward the book, when suddenly he heard terrifying screams that immediately caught his attention. The main character looked in the direction from which the strange sounds were coming. In that room, a lantern was burning, but with an unusual green light. Leon found himself in the right room, which was filled with monsters. Suddenly, the main character's attention was drawn to something interesting. Turned out to be a girl with her mouth tied shut. She was incredibly beautiful, and there were a huge number of monsters around her. Leon took out his book and began to read its contents rapidly. The first thing he read was The Secret of Raising the Dead. Outside the room, everything remained as it was, while the monsters did not stand still and headed towards Leon with the intention of attacking. The main character looked intently at the book, which said that the necromancer should first take a life, after which the guy began to close the book. Leon, with a cold look, began to take his weapon out of its sheath. The guy looked at the girl, who was very frightened and trembling with fear. The monsters looked intently at the main character, who was already fully prepared for the upcoming battle. The enemy instantly jumped up from his place and found himself right in front of Leon. The main character managed to dodge his enemy's attack, then prepared to counterattack immediately and successfully executed his move, attacking his opponent. The monster fell to the ground without even a hint of life. Meanwhile, the main character, with the same cold gaze, declared that this was the first life he had taken. In the past, the father stood with the main character in a cemetery, and the head of the family turned to Leon, warning him to listen carefully. He asked his son what they valued most, and he said that the answer was very simple. They revered death itself. He said that this was because they were necromancers who controlled the dead. The main character thought about his father's words, then asked how this was possible, to worship death. He began to tell his father that as necromancers, they were obliged to take lives and gain power by killing others. His father said that they were indeed dark magicians who instilled fear in the whole world. His father also told his son that this did not mean that they had to become heartless villains. The head touched the main character, asking him to promise that he would try to kill his enemies as gently as possible. The father looked straight at his son, hoping that he would do so in the future, while the main character looked intently at his father. In the present, the main character stood directly in front of the monsters, showing no emotion whatsoever, while the enemies managed to surround Leon on all sides. The guy started to move his foot, thinking about how he needed to attack all his enemies in their cervical vertebrae, as this was the most painless way to kill them. The demon was amazed that a man who had never wielded a sword before could strike the cervical vertebrae so accurately. The demon did not understand whether Leon was lucky or had an innate talent. The demon smiled, thinking that now everything would become completely clear, while the main character thought about how he had managed to defeat one of his opponents, which was more like luck than skill. He looked at one of the goblins, thinking about how they were cunning and deceitful by nature. Leon understood that fighting all of his enemies at once was a daunting task, after which the main character prepared for battle. The main character also understood perfectly well that it was difficult for him to judge height, and he also understood that his vision was fading with every passing second. The main character thought about how the first torch had gone out when he killed the first goblin, and that he needed to get used to the darkness as quickly as possible. The main character prepared to move, forming a plan in his head, after which he instantly found himself behind one of his enemies. With a murderous look in his eyes, the main character prepared to strike with his sword. Leon pierced the body of one of the monsters with his dagger. The enemy didn't have time to realize what was happening before he was dead, and another torch illuminating the area went out. One of the goblins began to scream, after which two enemies wanted to attack the main character. Leon noticed this in time, successfully dodged the attack, and prepared to strike with his sword, striking the body of another monster. Another torch in the room went out, and the main character thought that his eyes were getting used to the darkness and he could already see much better. The main character also understood perfectly well that his weapon was in terrible condition. Suddenly, Leon noticed something near him. It turned out to be one of the goblins who was ready to finish off the guy with his blow. Leon reacted and attacked the enemy, but it seemed that his opponent managed to avoid serious damage, with the monster receiving only a scratch on his cheek. The demon did not understand what had happened or why Leon had simply thrown away his weapon. The main character dodged the enemy's attack and then stared intently in that direction while the demon enjoyed the show. Leon instantly rushed to the weapon lying on the ground, only a few inches away from the coveted blade, while the demon smiled, watching the battle. The main character managed to grab the weapon while his enemy was right in front of him. The main character instantly lunged forward and was able to pierce his enemy's body through and through. Leon pulled his weapon back out of the defeated enemy's body, then attacked again to end the monster's life. The enemy's body began to fall to the ground, while Leon stood over it. Suddenly, the guy turned around and started moving away from the corpse. The main character moved towards the girl who was tied up. She looked at Leon and continued to tremble. The main character removed the rope from her mouth, after which she began to thank Leon for saving her with tears in her eyes. Unexpectedly, as she was about to thank the guy again for saving her, she fell silent. It turned out that the main character had pierced the girl's body with his sword. There was not a trace of regret in Leon's eyes, only coldness that sent shivers down the spine. The guy pulled out his sword and began to tell her about what his father had told him about monsters capable of changing their appearance, which he had encountered during his travels across the continent. The main character attacked the girl again, and she instantly began to transform and scream in pain. The girl looked very angry, while the hero remembered his father's other words, and an image appeared in his mind of his father saying that those who deceive and take advantage of the trust of others do not deserve a quick death. The main character said that creatures like the girl should experience the same despair and pain as their victims. Leon began to look terrifying, saying that the girl would have to endure a great deal of pain, after which terrible screams began to come from the room, and eventually the last light in the room went out. At that time, dancers were dancing to music in the house, there were a huge number of drinks in the bar, and the main character's uncle was hugging two girls and laughing out loud that he would soon get his hands on the whole place. One of the girls said that this would happen because no sane person would allow a child to become the boss. Another girl was amazed that the man had thought of using their family's enemies for his own purposes. The girl said that Uncle Leon's deed was magnificent, while the man himself said that they would only have to obey their enemies a little. The man enjoyed his drink, put down his glass and said that it was better to obey the enemy than to wipe the ass of the main character. Uncle Leon also made a crazy expression and said that in any case, winners are not judged. That's how it was in his circle. Everyone laughed and enjoyed their food. One of the advisors asked his master what he intended to do with Leon. He began to explain that many people in this place were still loyal to Leon's father, and it would be difficult to remove him from his position. The man reached for another drink, saying that the decision was very simple. He began to smile. Then with a grim expression on his face, he declared that they would kill Leon and claim that he had died under mysterious circumstances. The man said it was an excellent plan because the last time a dead man spoke was 100 years ago. Leon's uncle poured a drink into a glass, and then they drank to him, becoming the next head of the family. The man drank straight from the bottle, while his subordinate drank from a glass. They continued to enjoy themselves to the music, accompanied by beautiful girls. At that time, the head of the enemy family gathered his people and suggested that their plan to subjugate the main character's house was going according to plan. The man said that everything was going strictly according to plan and that very soon they would only need to wait for permission to start the war. The Lord smiled with joy, amazed at the stupidity of the main character's family, because they naively assumed that he would not attack them a second time. He began to play chess, saying that everything would work out very soon, and one of his men said that all this was only possible thanks to the Lord's genius. He looked at a photograph of the main character's uncle, named Kirchel, and marveled at the fact that the great history of this house would end because of some pathetic traitor. The Lord ordered his men to prepare everything necessary on time, after which he declared that very soon he would hear the sounds of despair from the son of the former head of their family. At that moment, in the cave where the main character was, the last torch went out, and Leon took his blood-stained knife from the monster's body. Then, without feeling any emotion, looked straight at the lifeless body. The main character thought about how, immediately after the last torch went out, complete darkness fell upon the place. Suddenly, Light began to appear around him, and it turned out that the torches had begun to burn with their usual flame. They were a very ordinary color, unlike how they had looked before. The main character began to fix his hair, assuming that the test was over. The demon began to say that it was simply incredible, after which he enthusiastically declared that he had never seen such talents before. The main character reacted too late to the demon's movements, causing him to fall to the ground after being hit by Marvas. The demon was overjoyed and said that the main character was even capable of surviving in a camp full of orcs, while Leon seemed completely unmoved by this. The demon said that the main character had stabbed a monster that was almost impossible to distinguish from a human. Leon began to get to his feet, admitting that he would prefer to avoid a camp full of orcs if possible. Leon put the demon on the ground, and the main character began to talk about how he had heard that orcs despised humans. The demon told Leon to stop thinking about it, because he was interested in how the guy managed to recognize the monster. The main character silently looked at the demon, then admitted that it was all in the torch, which continued to burn even after the others had gone out. The demon asked the guy to continue his story, after which Leon said that immediately after they entered the place, he noticed that the torches were burning with a strange light, and he immediately looked at the flames, which were an unnatural green color. Looking closer, he was completely sure of this, and the main character decided that the flames represented the shadows of the dead. Leon began to tell how, as confirmation of his theory, the torches went out after each monster died. At that moment, the main character noticed that even though he had killed all the monsters, one torch continued to burn brightly. Leon instantly realized where the last monster was hiding, and just as quickly realized that as long as this monster was alive, he would not be able to proceed. The main character sat in a pool of blood, while the demon was struck by such frightening composure. Looking at the main character, he couldn't understand how a 14-year-old boy could be so incredible. The demon understood perfectly well that in moments when someone's life is at stake, it is incredibly difficult to assess the situation and think rationally. The demon smiled because, in the end, the boy had coped with this test brilliantly. Suddenly, the demon realized that there was something more amazing hidden in Leon than just a normal supply of mana. Looking at the boy, he suspected that Leon might be hiding something else. The demon smiled broadly, because this intrigued him greatly. Marvas began to say that since the guy had managed to pass the first test, they should move on to the next one. The book of necromancy began to open, then returned to the page with instructions that he must first take a life. Leon grabbed the book and began to read that he must now raise the fallen. He looked at the huge number of corpses of his recently defeated enemies, and a smile appeared on Leon's face. The main character began to look like a real madman. Leon was thinking about how he should make the dead rise, when suddenly the demon began to give him a hint and asked the guy to look at the monsters he had just defeated, which Leon immediately did and redirected his gaze. The demon told him to direct his mana into his eyes to expand his field of vision, and Leon did so. The demon then said that the main character should see a thread stretching from each body in an unknown direction, after which Leon was indeed able to see threads stretching from the bodies of the enemies he had just defeated. Marvas began to explain that necromancers call this line the line of death. The main character suggested that these lines connected the souls of this world with the other world. The demon said that the boy's words were completely accurate, after which he explained that necromancers separate souls from bodies in order to awaken the bodies. After that, the monsters' bodies began to rise to their feet. As new life was breathed into them, they began to raise their heads, with an inverted cross on their foreheads, after which one of the monsters looked straight at the main character with a terrifying gaze. The demon said that he would demonstrate the principle first, after which one of the monsters headed straight for Leon, stopping just before striking him. The demon explained that this process could be considered branding. The demon said that although there were other methods, only this one allowed monsters to be resurrected, and he would explain the others later. The main character began to get to his feet, saying that he understood everything perfectly. The demon asked the guy to try it himself now that he understood the theory. Leon asked if he could ask a question before starting. Leon remembered that his ancestor had said that turning a human into a walking dead was many times more difficult than turning a monster. The main character, with an incredibly cold look, asked if he would be able to awaken people. And the demon noted that Leon said these words as if he would soon need to use this knowledge. The demon asked who was so unlucky that Leon decided to do this to him, after which the guy confessed that this person was his own uncle, Kerchel. The guy also confessed with a smile on his face that this man was also his only uncle. At that time, there were already a huge number of empty alcohol bottles in the house, and the guys continued to have fun hugging incredibly beautiful girls. They did not think at all about what was in store for them, and they certainly did not doubt that power already belonged to them. Kerchel declared that the former head of their house was a real idiot, after which he declared that he was many times better because he was the real favorite of fate. The man said that this was how it was and admitted that all they had to do was finish off Leon, after which the man also said that after the death of the main character, the burden on Kerchel's shoulders would become much lighter. The uncle said that killing his nephew was incredibly easy. Kerchel suggested drinking alcohol until they were drunk on the day of their victory. Suddenly, a terrible noise rang out in the building and it began to shake. Unexpectedly, the thread holding the chandelier broke, causing the huge chandelier to fall directly onto the table. Kerchel didn't understand what was happening, and the girl couldn't believe that the powerful magical artifact protecting this place had failed. Suddenly, Kerchel's expression changed dramatically, and he instantly ordered the girl to be quiet. The man asked who dared to come to them, adding that no one in this area had the right to attempt his life. Suddenly, the man heard the voice of the main character behind him, who was amazed at where Kerchel got so much confidence in his stupid words. It seemed that the man did not take the boy seriously at all, after which he instantly summoned a huge number of assassins. The main character looked silently at his uncle, then said with a cruel expression on his face that he found his uncle's confidence amusing. The man asked what business the boy had to disturb him, while the main character was amazed that the man really believed that the lord of these lands needed permission to move around his own territory. The uncle's face changed, as if these words had hurt him, and he asked if this was appropriate behavior for a leader. Suddenly, the man's expression changed, saying that they both knew that the boy was simply not worthy of being called the leader of this place. The man began to shout that the boy was just afraid that his position as leader would be taken away. Kerchel shouted that the boy was too late and that his father, who was currently feeding the worms with his own flesh, would certainly not be able to help him, while Leon himself watched silently. The main character began to move towards his enemy. Then, with a terrible expression on his face, he declared that he understood perfectly well that he was now responsible for his own safety. The enemy began to shout that the boy was really stupid to come to him personally. Meanwhile, Leon said that it was stupid of his uncle to assume that they had come to this place alone. It seemed that the man did not understand what the boy was saying, while the ground beneath Kerchel's feet began to shake violently. He noticed that the magic that appeared was unusual. It was definitely dark magic. Kerchel felt a real abyss, thinking that this was a familiar feeling. Suddenly, the man thought of something terrible and assured himself that such a thing simply could not be, when suddenly, right in front of him, living dead appeared. The main character continued on his way, then confirmed that these were indeed real living dead. The enemy couldn't believe his eyes, because even the main character's father wasn't capable of such a thing, while Leon declared that their house had finally regained power over necromancy. The enemy was beside himself with rage at what was happening, after which he ordered his men to destroy the main character, who wasted no time in carrying out the order. They ran at great speed toward Leon, who looked indifferently at the sword that was only a few inches from his face. Suddenly, one of the goblins began to move, then incredibly quickly knocked the weapon out of one of the enemy's hands. The enemy couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't expect such a thing from a living corpse, while the monster had no intention of stopping and was preparing to finish off the man, after which he cut the enemy in two with an incredibly precise swing of his sword. The man stood for only a few moments before collapsing to the ground right in front of Kerchel, who was, to say the least, stunned by what he had seen. The monsters were overwhelming his strongest fighters, and it seemed that they would lose the battle very soon. The enemy suddenly began to feel fear towards these monsters. Suddenly, Kerchel, seeing blood splattering right in front of him, realized that something was wrong. He couldn't understand how what he was seeing could be real. The man began to gather magical power in his hand. The enemy was determined to finish off the main character with magic, because Leon possessed necromancy. Kerchel couldn't understand how it was possible for a young man to possess such incredible power. He finished preparing the magic in his hand and looked at the main character with anger, while a sphere of magic was visible in his hand. The enemy began to shout, not understanding what Leon had done to obtain a power that was a parody of their founder's power. Meanwhile, the main character was amazed that it was strange for his uncle to have the power to control the dead. The enemy began to shout that this was impossible, because the art of necromancy had long since disappeared, shouting that even the main character's father had not been able to master this power, while Leon himself listened silently to this whining. The enemy simply did not want to believe that his brother's useless offspring could be any different from them. The main character was struck by how stubborn his uncle was and began to emit an aura, wanting to prove his power. The main character also warned Kerchel with a cold stare that his choice was incredibly stupid. A moment later, the main character's magic rushed toward the goblins, after which the goblins began to smile eerily, and a moment later headed toward Kerchel. The enemy stood completely alone, seemingly having lost all his soldiers, while the monsters rapidly approached him. The enemy prepared to attack with his already prepared magic, then attacked with a cry for everyone to die. The enemy's attack hit the goblins running towards him, and their bodies seemed to have taken critical damage. The enemy had already begun to hope that victory was in his pocket, because the monsters had indeed taken so much damage that their bones were visible due to the lack of skin. However, the main character's magic appeared near the goblin bodies, after which they suddenly came back to life and headed straight for the enemy. The enemy did not expect this. He thought that after his magic, the monsters would die. Kerchel began to shout for his subordinates to help him survive this situation, but after a moment, he was struck by the realization of what was happening. All of his subordinates, on whom he had pinned his hopes, lay dead on the ground. Kerchel began to prepare to repeat his attack, then struck the bodies of the monsters running towards him with magic, but this time the monsters did not even stop, while Kerchel was well aware that his magic skills were completely useless. The enemy began to shout that Leon would surely regret his decision, that if the hero dared to finish what he had started, there would be no turning back. Suddenly, a dagger flew toward Kerchel, piercing his shoulder, and the enemy began to scream in pain, seemingly in terrible agony. Blood began to flow from the old man's body, and very quickly. The enemy did not seem to be giving up and was preparing for another attack, but unexpectedly, his magic began to simply disintegrate. The uncle began to shout that there was no forgiveness for Leon, because he dared to go against his own flesh and blood. Meanwhile, Leon approached Kerchel, saying that he remembered a treatise he had heard from his father. The main character declared that there are only winners and losers, and history is always written by the victor. The enemy was enraged by such insolence, for the young man had decided that he was capable of lecturing him. The main character confessed that, as a person devoid of emotions, it was difficult for him to understand this treatise, after which the enemy listened to how the main character had nevertheless managed to understand something from the treatise. The main character was very close to Kerchel and told him that forgiveness was the privilege of the victor. Leon also added that once upon a time, his own uncle was in the winner's place, and the main character also said that Kerchel considered himself the winner when he framed his father. The enemy began to shout at the young man to shut his mouth, seemingly beside himself with rage. The main character decided to say goodbye to Kerchel, saying that he wished him more suffering. Leon began to use magic, saying that he would cherish this day very much. The main character said that he would take away his uncle's hope for tomorrow, after which the main character's goblins headed towards the enemy. When the enemy came to his senses, he saw the blade of the sword right in front of his face. A moment later, the dirty traitor's life was over, and he lay on the ground in a pool of his own blood. The hand lay on the ground, after which the demon approached the enemy's corpse, saying that Leon was indeed crazy, because even the demon himself would have shown emotion at such a sight. The demon also did not understand how the main character managed to control the dead so easily, because from the outside it seemed as if the guy had been doing this for decades. Leon looked at the body of his enemy, then suddenly his expression changed, and he made a terrifying face and declared that he had just had an excellent idea. The demon assumed that the excellent idea was most likely something terrible. The next morning, the council members gathered at the table, although some seats were empty. One of the men complained about the timing of the council meeting, then asked if anyone else knew why Kerchel had called them. Another man admitted that he, like the rest, had no idea, adding that even Kerchel's assistant had not arrived. The bald man said that in any case, an urgent council meeting meant that something serious was in store for them. He was also worried that there might be news of a sudden attack, but another man asked him not to panic, as he found it hard to believe that their enemies would break the agreement they had made. He also said that in any case, a declaration of war required the official permission of the king, so the men decided to just wait, as there was no point in guessing. Some time passed, and then there was a sound of doors opening. It turned out to be Leon, who had also arrived for the meeting. The main character began to move to his seat without even exchanging a word with those present. People did not understand what was happening, because Kerchel had scheduled the meeting, but Leon had arrived. The main character continued walking amid talk that Kerchel did not care about Leon. The main character looked quite scary and said nothing at all, after which he turned to face everyone present. Leon assumed that all the council members were expecting to see Kerchel instead of him, after which the guy grabbed a chair and said that Kerchel would not be able to join the meeting. The main character, with a terrifying expression, declared that Kerchel was simply unable to attend. One of the men tensed up and asked Leon to explain his words, after which Leon sat down in the head seat and said that Kerchel was dead. This seemed to instantly frighten the council members, while the main character confirmed that Kerchel had died last night at his hands. Leon asked if the council members had any further questions. This shocked all the council members. It seemed they could not have expected such words from the main character. Suddenly, one of the men slammed his fist on the table and began shouting that he insisted on a detailed explanation of Leon's words. The main character listened silently as the man demanded an explanation for the murder of the council's oldest member. Another counselor stated that even if Leon was the head of the clan, he was still obligated to report to them. The main character did not seem to like this at all, after which he declared that Kerchel was a true traitor. The council members listened as the hero said that Kerchel had given information to the enemy that had led to the death of the previous head of their family, after which the main character declared that Kerchel had been planning to usurp power, which was a true betrayal. Leon said that even considering all of Kerchel's crimes, the council members continued to defend him, which was very strange. After these words, there was complete silence at the table. The man was well aware that Kerchel's absence from the meeting meant only that he was indeed dead. Another advisor could not understand how Kerchel could have allowed himself to die at the hands of a boy. The man bit his finger, thinking that now was not the time to worry about Kerchel. He understood perfectly well that he needed to change sides as soon as possible, because if he didn't, it would be the end of him. He began to shout that he had no idea what atrocities Kerchel had committed, then said that they were truly terrible deeds for which the old man deserved to die. Another advisor instantly realized that everything was terrible, and he immediately began shouting that none of them knew anything about Kerchel's actions and that they had nothing to do with it. Leon began tapping his finger on the table, then ordered all the council members to shut up. The main character declared that even if the council's words were true, they still failed to do their job, which was also a crime. The council member realized that they had just been deceived by the main character. The bald man did not understand if Leon had any evidence that Kerchel was a traitor, and the main character listened silently to the accusations that he had killed an innocent man. Leon confessed that all the council members had reacted exactly as someone more perceptive than him had predicted. The demon smiled on the main character's shoulder, seemingly enjoying the situation that was unfolding. The main character's face changed, and he instantly took out his book, saying that he would now provide the evidence that the counselors demanded. A moment later, the room began to fill with a huge amount of dark magic, and the main character began to read a spell, after which all the council members began to look at him with extreme attention. As soon as the hero finished the spell, goblins began to appear from under the ground, and there were just a huge number of them. The book Leon was holding in his hands was emitting magic. The men couldn't believe their eyes, because it was the ability to summon the dead, while Kirchhoff's body also began to appear from under the floor. The man couldn't believe that Leon had managed to obtain the forgotten art of their clan. It seemed as if he instantly realized that at this rate, it would be the end for all of them. The main character asked Kirchhoff if he would confess his crimes before he finally lost consciousness, while the man himself stood there emitting a purple aura. The council member couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't understand how such a thing could be possible. Leon admitted that such questions were beginning to tire him, after which he confessed that there was nothing surprising about a necromancer controlling the dead. One of the men began to shout that they should run and save themselves, and the bald man began to run away, shouting that Leon should burn in hell for what he had done. Another member of the council couldn't resist because the man was blocking his way, but the man's head flew off his shoulders and he died instantly. The body collapsed to the ground, frightening the council member, who had not expected such a thing. Suddenly, the man heard the cries of his colleagues behind him and saw a white-haired man begging for mercy because he wanted to live. In the past, the great council member looked terribly pitiful, crawling on the ground like a real worm, while Leon approached him and said that their meeting was not over yet and that they were forbidden to leave the room. The main character said that they should listen carefully to the head's words until he finished, after which Kirchhoff began to bend over his former ally and opened his mouth, which looked very scary. The main character asked Kirchhoff if there was even one person in the room who did not know about his evil deeds. Kirchhoff stood still for a while, then began to say that everyone who had served the former head of this house knew about his evil deeds and plans. Leon said that the man's answer was perfectly clear to him. One of the council members began to hysterically beg for mercy, and another joined in and began to repent for all his sins. The bald man begged for a chance to prove their loyalty, but he noticed movement near his head, and a moment later, the monsters began to cut the council members to pieces amid their terrible screams. Suddenly, Leon noticed something interesting. He raised his hand and began to speak, saying that as the leader, he had decided to make a statement to the council. He held a book of necromancy in his other hand and declared that he had awakened the dark art of necromancy within himself. The main character stood over the bodies of the former council members. Then suddenly Leon realized something. He asked the man hiding behind the wall where Pullen was. The man was trembling with fear but began to come out from behind the wall. He confessed that Pullen had been sent to the dungeon for inciting rebellion. The main character ordered the man to take him to the dungeon, after which the guy began to move. The main character opened the doors in front of him, then turned to the man and said with a terrifying look that he could escape if he wanted to. It turned out that the main character was addressing the servants in the house, and he also said that he would not take responsibility for the consequences of their escape. The people listened as Leon warned them that they should make the right decision. It seemed that everyone was seriously frightened by this warning. Meanwhile, in the enemy castle, a man approached his lord, who greeted him. He handed him a letter and said it was addressed to the Lord. The man grabbed the letter, not knowing what it could be, then began to take out the contents of the envelope and carefully read everything that was written in the letter. The Lord's face changed instantly, as if he had received what he had so desired. The Lord declared that everything was going according to plan, adding that even the Empire had turned its back on the House of Marvas. The subordinate said that the main character's house had nothing to boast about except for the deeds of their ancestor, after which he began to mock the entire family of the main character. The Lord also supported his subordinate's opinion that the Marvas house was incredibly weak and powerless. The Lord said that in any case, they should stick to their plan, after which he declared with a mad smile that they would bring the Marvas family to its knees again next month. The subordinate also reported that their request had been fulfilled. The Lord assumed that they simply could not lose the war, and his subordinate said that they would definitely win, because it was impossible for the founder of the clan to come back to life and save them. The Lord smiled as he listened to this information, confident of total victory, assuming that the main character would not even be able to resist. At that moment, in the dungeon where Leon had been sent, he heard the voice of Pullen, who bowed his head and began to beg for forgiveness, for it was he who had allowed the traitors to carry out their plan. The subordinate told Leon that he deserved nothing better than death, while the main character looked at the prisoner realizing that this man was the only vassal who had openly spoken out against Kerchal. Leon immediately asked Poland to stand up, saying that they had a lot of work to do that he couldn't handle without help. The man continued to cry, not understanding how he could be of any use, since he turned out to be a real fool. The main character looked at his hand, which he had touched the incredibly smelly and dirty man, then ordered him to wash up and immediately go to the head's office where they could talk. The main character began to leave, saying that they would discuss all the details in the office, while Poland beamed with happiness and swore that he would serve Leon forever. Poland began to shout that he swore his loyalty to Leon. Some time passed, and the main character stood by the window with the demon on his back, also looking out the window. Marvas licked his paw, and there was silence between them, when suddenly the demon broke the silence and asked what the hero was going to do next. Leon thought deeply about how to overcome the crisis his home was in. After the conversation, Poland was struck by what he had heard and began to say that it was too risky to go to a meeting with enemies pretending to be Kerchal. Poland also stated that in order to convincingly play Kerchal, incredible artistry was needed. The main character began to exude an aura, saying that he would now demonstrate how he planned to pull it off. A moment later, a shadow began to rise from the ground, which immediately began to change its appearance and become covered with skin, and after a few seconds, Kerchal himself appeared, who, at least outwardly, was almost impossible to distinguish from the original. Polars couldn't understand how this was possible. He had never seen such magic before, while in his mind he was amazed at Leon's composure, because he had just created a living dead man out of his own uncle. The main character looked truly terrifying because of his calmness, while his servant began to admire him, because the rumors that Leon had mastered necromancy turned out to be true. Leon declared that he had indeed mastered the forgotten art. Polars thought that now they would be able to get everything they wanted because heaven had finally turned its face toward them, when suddenly the man thought about something and said that this method would allow them to fool their enemies for a while, but in any case they would uncover the deception. Looking at the fake Kerchal, he said that the dead were incapable of imitating a person's speech and character, while Leon said that the man's words were true, but that what he saw before him was not exactly Kerchal's corpse. The main character confessed that what Polar was looking at was the corpse of a doppelganger capable of changing its appearance. Leon explained that the monster was capable of completely copying a human being, even their magical abilities. This seemed to shock the vassal, who was seeing such a thing for the first time, while Leon waited silently, seemingly well aware that a brutal slaughter was about to ensue. It turned out that, in the past, as soon as he pulled the sword out of the girl's body, the last lantern went out. Leon stood and looked at the corpse of the monster he had just defeated, while the girl continued to lie on the ground without changing her appearance. He asked the demon what this monster was called, and the demon told him that it was called a doppelganger. Marvas said that this monster was capable of completely copying a person, even their memories, abilities, and personality. The demon also said that this terrifying creature loved to copy people who lagged behind the group, adding that these monsters killed the originals in order to gain people's trust. Leon thought deeply about the incredible abilities of the monster, while the demon thought about how similar the descendant was to the founder and smiled. Leon began the process of raising the monster, after which the girl got to her feet and stood directly in front of Leon and the demon. Marvas thought about how incredibly sweet it was that the founder had left a gift to his heir. The monster stood still and emitted a huge amount of energy. The main character looked closely at the creature, then asked if he could subdue such a monster. Marvas said that of course the main character could do it. The demon also said that the monster could only copy the images of those whom Leon had seen, and could not copy targets that had more magical power. The demon asked if Leon understood his words, adding that although the boy had great talent, he was still inexperienced. The demon said that even if Leon could subdue his uncle's soul, it would be incredibly difficult to keep it near him. The demon suggested that the main character simply lie low for a while to gather strength, but Leon said that he would never turn his back on his home. The main character understood perfectly well that if he was not there, a huge number of innocent people would die. The demon asked if the guy was willing to risk his own life for these people, and the hero confessed that he would gladly die for them. The demon did not understand why the boy was so determined to protect his family, But in the end, he decided to forget about it because there were more important matters to deal with. The monster took on its true form, which resembled a shadow. The demon said that it was time for the guy to turn this ugly monster into his pawn. The main character was amazed, assuming that Marvas knew this creature, and the demon confessed that this monster used to be the founder's favorite puppet. The demon also said that such a monster would be useful to Leon, but added that it had an annoying personality. Leon began the process of subjugating the monster, then began to recite the spell necessary for the ritual. The monster finally began to take shape, its body woven from energy. The monster stood directly in front of the hero and did not take any action, after which he came to his senses and opened his eyes, whereupon Marvas instantly struck the monster on the back of the head, saying that it was time for him to wake up, saying that they finally had their first contractor after such a long time. The demon began to yell at the monster, calling it a stupid creature, because it hadn't thought to take on a normal form in order to talk. It seemed that the monster simply did not know what to turn into, when suddenly a brilliant idea popped into his head. He crossed his fingers, and the monster's body began to cover itself with skin, after which he turned into the main character, saying that the demon was too arrogant for a cat. Marvas seemed beside himself with rage at such a humiliating comparison, while the monster called Marvas a stupid cat. The main character looked straight into the face of his perfect copy. In the present, Puller realized that in this situation, they could easily deceive their enemies, and he began to talk about how this trick would definitely work in their favor. The main character was glad to hear such words from his subordinate. The vassal asked if he could ask a question, then stated that it was logical that their enemies were already preparing for war, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Leon was going to stay instead of running away, and he was worried about it. The main character instantly remembered the words of the demon, who had said something similar, and then stated as seriously as possible that it was his duty as head of the family to stay with the other members of his family. Pullen declared that as a loyal vassal, he would follow any decision made by the head, but asked what exactly had led the young man to this decision. The main character confessed that he had been thinking about how to solve their problems for a very long time, admitting that he simply wanted to become a worthy head of this place and do everything possible for its prosperity. The leader also shocked his subordinate by saying that after winning the war, he would continue to reflect on the situation. The main character began to smile and then declared that he would suppress any attempts to take anything away from them. The main character decided that as long as he fought for these lands and did not repeat his mistakes, sooner or later he would find the answer to the question of why he was fighting. The main character finished his speech and smiled. Some time later, in the main character's bedroom, the monster complained that he could not even imagine that this house would fall so low. The monster admitted that they had a huge number of things to do, while the demon continued to taunt him. The demon and the monster began to argue about how to address Leon, and the demon also admitted that the main character was weak in terms of social cues. Leon was surprised that Marvas was able to know this, because it was true. The demon began to say that it was intuition and said that the monster used to be a familiar ancestor. The demon also stated that, in the end, the monster was given to the main character as an inheritance from the founder. The demon recounted how Crow had once been a loyal servant and assassin in the hands of the founder. The main character pondered how the ability to transform was indeed incredibly useful for assassinations. The monster began to say that he would be much more useful than some cat. Leon admitted that he really needed Crow's abilities, after which he asked the monster to pretend to be Kirchel. The demon continued to provoke the monster, who seemed to ignore the cat's words. The main character told them to stop the commotion, when suddenly someone started knocking on the door, and Leon wondered who had arrived. It turned out to be Pullen, who looked very alarmed. It turned out that a letter had arrived directly from their enemies, and he hurried to hand it to the boy. The letter said that the main character's house was weak and terrible, and that the enemies were challenging them to a fair fight between their houses. The Count also wrote that if the main character's house surrendered, they would spare the lives of ordinary people. The Lord also threatened that if they refused, his army would arrive and destroy everything. The main character read that all of this had already been approved by the king. The demon said that this was to be expected from the enemies, while Leon thought about the fact that there was only a month left before the war. The demon said that they could simply run away, gather their strength and take revenge, while Leon began to summon magic in his hand, then admitted that the demon had misunderstood him, because in reality he was not sure he could endure a whole month before the war. The demon was angry and worried because their enemy's army had hundreds of soldiers, and it was a completely different scale. The main character listened silently to the demon's words, then declared that he was completely confident in his victory. Leon said with a grim look that they would not need to spare anyone and could take the life of every enemy. On the street, people began to discuss Kirchel's disappearance, which greatly alarmed them. One old man was worried and hoped that at least the new leader was all right. People assumed that it was very difficult for Leon, because he had lost two of his closest relatives in such a short period of time. One man assumed that Leon was very strong and would cope, while the old man decided that the enemy would definitely not start another war, because they had recently been defeated. People were truly worried about the future, because times were far from peaceful, when suddenly Puller reminded ordinary people that even words could sink a ship. The main character stood behind his vassal, while people began to ask for forgiveness, saying that they had only decided to take a short break between work. The main character listened to the condolences of the common people and showed no emotion. The man said that he was sorry that Leon had lost his uncle, when suddenly Leon announced that his uncle was alive and had just fallen ill suddenly. The main character, with a calm expression on his face, assured people that they had nothing to worry about. Leon began to leave, thinking that in order to deceive the enemy, he must first deceive his friends. The main character said that they should convince the surviving vassals and witnesses not to talk about what they knew. Pullers did not understand why the leader had visited the city center, saying that he was ready to get anything so that Leon would not have to worry. The main character appreciated the vassal's loyalty and said that he needed to check some things personally. The demon said that they had arrived at their destination, then added that he sensed an incredible surge of magic in the building in front of them. The guys looked at the huge building in front of them. Then Leon ordered his vassal to stay outside. Then, ignoring the man, began to move toward the door, ordering his vassal to make sure no one entered. The main character also added that Pullen should not let anyone inside. Leon began to open the doors in front of him, after which he saw a rather horrific scene. There were blood splatters everywhere and destroyed objects. The people inside were cleaning up the mess, while the hero watched silently for a while. One of the people inside had ears on his head, and Leon instantly assumed that this was the man they were looking for. It turned out to be a skinny guy with gray hair, his whole body covered in horrible scars. However, the main character saw incredible potential in this seemingly ordinary guy. The demon said that there was not a single person among the main character's vassals with such keen eyesight, because such talent would be wasted in a place like this. Leon approached the guy and asked if he could spare some time. The guy began to apologize for what had happened in their place, saying that it was because of rowdy visitors. He also said that they would be grateful if Leon would come again next time. As the girl approached, she instantly began to beat Walter with her foot because the guy dared to speak to the chief. The girl began to apologize for her man, saying that the boss should not associate with a lowly beast tamer. The girl's gaze turned back to Walter, and she hit the guy in the face again, saying that he had no idea who he was talking to. The girl began to shout that the hero was the youngest master of the Marvas family. Walter began to apologize for what he had done, namely, not recognizing such a high-ranking person. Leon repeated that he would like to speak with Walter for a moment, while the girl decided that the guy had addressed her and said that she would consider it an honor. Leon stated that he was not talking to the girl, after which he said that he originally had business with Walter. The guy did not understand what was happening. He seemed even frightened by it. He lowered his head. He did not understand what the main character meant by his words. Looking at Leon, he realized that he was a high-ranking person and didn't know what he wanted from him. The main character began to fill his hand with a huge amount of magic, after which the mana rushed towards Walter. The main character's mana headed towards the guy's scars, after which they began to quickly disappear from the guy's body. Walter didn't understand how or why Leon had just healed his old wounds. The main character decided to ask one last time if the guy would give him a minute, while the girl watched what was happening with dissatisfaction. The girl apologized for interrupting and explained that Walter was her personal slave. She also added that the guy had no right to dispose of his time and that Leon should ask her about everything. The main character thought about how this girl wasn't there when he dealt with Kerchel, then started smiling, thinking about how she didn't know. The main character asked how long slavery had been allowed in their place, then, not waiting for an answer, added that it was time to address him properly, since he was the head of this place. The main character closed his eyes. It seemed that the girl felt some fear and disgust. Her people were also nervous, waiting for what Leon would say. Emitting a huge amount of aura, he suggested that the girl simply did not recognize him as the rightful ruler of these lands. The demon was incredibly happy. He thought the guy had said those words perfectly. The demon also said that it was right to put these people in their place, because Leon was the head of this place. The main character also confessed that he was bothered by more than just one person. He stated that if the girl had other slaves, he demanded that they be freed immediately, adding that she only had 10 minutes. It seemed that the girl did not like these words at all. She was angry, but then she suddenly started smiling and asked if the main character was ready for the consequences of his demands. The girl pretended to remember that she had again ignored Leon. The main character said that there was nothing wrong with the girl admitting her mistake, while Walter seemed very nervous. The guy did not understand what he had done to deserve such kindness, since he was a dirty slave. The girl instantly snapped her fingers, and a moment later, the main character and the guy were surrounded by a huge number of men. The girl shouted for the men to attack, saying that Kerchel had promised to cover them if anything happened. The main character stood still as his enemies rapidly approached him. Leon's face changed. Then he stretched out his hand, from which mana turned into liquid, then touched the ground. A moment later, goblins appeared throughout the room, after which the girl's men were unable to put up even a decent fight. The girl did not expect this and was frightened. The main character took out his sword and asked one of the goblins for his sword, as the main character's sword was worn out. Leon began to take the goblin's weapon, then approached the battlefield, and a moment later ended the life of one of the men with a well-aimed blow to his neck. The girl couldn't understand how this was possible. She couldn't believe that a child could have such enormous strength. Walter, who was watching this, was shocked, but the main character decided to explain why the boy deserved his mercy. Leon declared that from that moment on, he would always need the boy. Walter didn't understand how he could be of any use to the Lord himself. He thought about how he had been nothing but a vagrant his entire life. In the past, little Walter had been lying in a puddle, begging for the bullying to stop, while people continued to beat him and yell that he was a dirty animal. In fact, even as a child, he didn't understand why people were so cruel to him, why they enjoyed hurting him. At that moment, he was just an ordinary child who had done nothing wrong. But his eyes began to change and gradually turn black, until they were completely black with red pupils. The boy's body began to emit a huge amount of energy that repelled the children. Walter asked his tormentors why they continued to attack him. It seemed that the boy was consumed by immense rage, and he began to scream again, asking why the children were doing such terrible things. Then, as soon as he came to his senses, he realized why this was happening. The dead bodies of his attackers were lying right in front of him. The guy was very scared. He didn't want to do anything like that. Walter ran away, unwilling to accept that he was a real monster. In the present, the girl lost all her warriors, after which she began to scream that the hero would not be able to defeat Kerchel. She shouted that Leon was a useless offspring, while Leon himself listened attentively. Leon said that maybe her words were true, then said that he had no intention of remaining a useless son. The main character filled his hand with magic and said that he would become a worthy head of the house. The guy was ready to give orders to his warriors, then declared that people like the girl had no place on his land, which made the girl panic and yell that Leon was an arrogant bastard. Sometime later, it was all over and the main character turned toward the guy. He didn't seem to understand what would happen to him next. Walter realized that even though Leon was a killer, he was not afraid of him. The main character stood directly in front of the guy and asked if Walter wanted to join him, because he thought the guy had good skills. These words seemed to shock the guy. He didn't expect to hear something like that. He apologized and asked if he could ask for one thing. Walter's body began to fill with a huge amount of aura. after which his appearance changed and he looked like a beast. Walter revealed that he was a demonic wolf, a race that was reviled by all. Walter asked the main character if he would be treated this way for the rest of his life, but Leon said that from that moment on, no one would dare look down on him. These words shocked Walter, who listened attentively to the hero's words about not knowing much about the boy's appearance. The hero also promised that Walter only needed to let him know about any prejudices and he would deal with them. The hero declared that from that moment on, the boy would become a full-fledged vassal of their house, after which they stood for a while and looked at each other in silence. The main character said that he was giving his sincere promise. Hearing these words, Walter could not hold back his tears and began to cry, while the main character took the young man by the hand and suggested that Walter's silence should be taken as consent. Deeply moved by these words, Walter promised that he would serve Leon happily. Some time later, in the king's castle, a man arrived before the king himself, who was sitting on the throne. The emperor seemed to be feeling unwell. There was no life in his eyes, while his son looked completely normal, which was quite strange. The prince asked what the vassal wanted to see the king about. The man reported that a letter had arrived from the house of Sylvester. The prince seemed very unhappy that, in addition to his own problems, he now had to deal with the problems of the counties. The prince also said that his father was very unhappy about this, while the emperor himself looked like a vegetable. The man immediately fell to his knees and began to say that he only wanted to share the good news. The prince seemed very interested in the words of good tidings, while the man understood perfectly well that the prince himself ruled the empire and he simply could not afford to fall out of favor. The prince seemed to soften a little and began to think. The man, with a smile on his face, began to talk about a place that the prince hated with all his heart, after which his expression changed and he said that they, the Sylvesters, could unite with the emperor in order to destroy the main character's house once and for all. The prince was interested in such a proposal and seemed about to agree, saying that open war could backfire, since that house possessed the power of necromancy. The man began to tell him that the power of Marvas had long since disappeared and that there was no worthy successor, while the power of the Sylvesters had only grown and they were now capable of victory. The prince ordered that the plan be carried out, saying that it was the perfect time to destroy the main character's family. The man immediately began to leave while the prince watched, after which the prince turned to his father, saying that he would finally be able to get rid of a remnant of the past, although the emperor himself did not react to these words at all, while the prince's hands reached out toward his father. It turned out that the emperor had become nothing more than a soulless puppet of the prince, who was about to transfer all power to himself very soon. At that time, Walter, Puller, and the monster were near the main character, after which Puller suggested that Walter always carry the artifact with him, because ordinary people did not trust his race. The man also said that they valued the young man very much, but for now they could not ignore the opinion of the people. Unexpectedly, due to the artifact's actions, Walter's ears began to disappear. As a result, the young man was shocked by this and did not seem to be worried about such a trifle. Pullers was glad that Walter turned out to be so quick-witted, while Leon said that they all needed to discuss very important matters. The main character said that he wanted to insist that all the guys take an oath, not just in words. Leon asked his people if they were ready to devote themselves to serving him faithfully. Puller didn't hesitate for a second and, with tears in his eyes, declared that this was all he had ever dreamed of. The man began to speak with all his might about how he would be loyal to the leader, and Leon listened as an adult man cried because he wanted to show his loyalty. The monster was amazed at how the main character was able to win over a person so strongly, while the demon said that the key rules of their home were obedience and domination. Walter began to say that he completely shared Puller's feelings, after which he put his hand on his chest and looked confidently at Leon. The main character was talking to his monster and demon, and Walter did not understand who the head was talking to. Leon said that, in order to make everything serious, they had to draw up a contract reinforced with mana. Leon also began to say that in case of refusal, he would consider it as a refusal to serve him. It seemed that Walter had no idea what kind of contract this was, but then the hero explained that this contract created an unbreakable bond between people, allowing them to share their deepest secrets. Leon rose from his seat and stood directly in front of the boys. Leon said that they should proceed if the boys had no objections, after which dark magic began to pour out of the main character's body, immediately turning into a sheet of paper, which was presented to the boys, who were shocked by this. The demon sat silently with his eyes closed, when suddenly he began to take on his true majestic form. Marvas emitted an enormous amount of aura and began to speak about how, as a representative of this house, he would witness this contract. The people listened to the demon, who said that from that moment on, even their souls would serve unquestioningly. The main character was completely serious, after which mana instantly filled the space around them. In the end, the people were finally able to see the incredibly majestic demon before them. They seemed shocked by such a sight, as they had never seen anything like it before. The main character decided to end with drama, after which he said that these people were his loyal subjects and asked that they show them minimal respect. Marvas declared that from that moment on, the agreement was successfully concluded, after which the demon began to tell them that even the slightest betrayal would cost them their souls. Puller confidently declared that he had no intention of doing so, after which he began to think that the real Marvas, who had once signed a contract with their founder, had appeared before him. Now it seemed that the man was beginning to understand how Leon had been able to gain such power in such a short time. Walter was amazed at the mana the demon possessed. He thought that his family had always been sensitive to mana, but now his body was freezing. Walter simply could not comprehend who Leon really was, or for that matter, the majestic demon behind him. Suddenly, the mana began to change, after which the demon took on his simple appearance and entered energy-saving mode. Walter couldn't help himself and said that Marvas looked like a cute kitten. Puller intervened in time and covered the naive boy's mouth, while Marvas himself asked what they were talking about, as he hadn't heard everything. Puller said that the guy was just amazed by the demon's power, and it seemed like those words flattered Marvas. The demon started talking about how from now on, his existence had to be kept secret from everyone else, and only those he allowed could see him. The demon also said that he understood that the aristocrats were very interested in Kerchiel. For a moment, the guys didn't know what to say, while Walter confessed that a girl had once received a letter and was obliged to pass it on to Kerchiel. The main character immediately asked where he could find the letter the guy was talking about. Unexpectedly, Crow interrupted the conversation, saying that he knew where the letter was, and he began to take out a huge chest, saying that the guys were idiots for forgetting to pick up the trophies. Inside the chest was a huge amount of treasure, various precious stones, and gold. The demon remembered how petty Crow was, saying that Crow had decided he could take whatever he wanted because Leon was going to destroy the building and everyone inside anyway. The main character began to examine the contents of the chest, when suddenly his gaze changed. Among the treasures was the very letter that had been intended for Kerchiel. Leon picked up the letter, saying that it was exactly what they were looking for. The demon was amazed that even Crow could be useful at times, while the monster himself did not understand whether it was a compliment or a reproach. The main character was about to read the letter aloud. The letter said that the enemies were declaring war on the main character's family. It also said that despite his high status, Leon's house had not fulfilled its duties, and there were threats that if Leon raised the white flag, then the peaceful people would have a chance to save their lives. The main character finished reading the letter, which was a real declaration of war. The guy seemed shocked by this information, while the main character thought about the 1-month deadline. Leon admitted that he had a very funny idea, then confessed that since gaining the ability to control the dead, he had discovered a huge opportunity for fun. Crow stood aside while the main character looked in his direction, after which Leon turned to the monster and told him that he had a separate mission for Crow. At that time, in the enemy's house, a man reported that the declaration of war had been successfully delivered to Marvas. The man also talked about the funny expression on Kerchiel's face as he begged them not to do it. The Lord assumed that Kerchiel was having a real tantrum. The Lord also said that in any case they needed to keep Kerchiel alive, saying that the man had proven to be a useful spoiled brat, which is why he was allowed to take power for a while. Lord inquired about Leon, who was supposed to inherit the position of head, and the man began to say that there was no news about the main character, assuming that he had been killed long ago. The Lord seemed completely happy with how things were going, and he also seemed not to understand why they should worry about a 14-year-old child. It seemed that the man did not consider Leon at all, while the Lord put on an incredibly serious face and asked what was the most unjust thing that could happen to a person. The man confessed that he was not a scholar who could understand such wisdom, while Lord fell silent for a moment, then declared that the most unjust thing was to encounter such a powerful enemy that it was impossible to resist. The Lord believed that there was no suffering worse than this. The Lord asked the man if he understood what could cause such injustice, and when he did not receive an answer, he said that only incredible talent could be the cause of such injustice. The man suggested that the Lord thought Leon might possess such talent, but the Lord asked the man not to be foolish, for Leon was, after all, the heir to a great family. The man said that from now on he would try to be wiser. The main character looked at Crow, who had taken on his appearance exactly, and was amazed at how perfectly the monster had copied his speech and memories. Crow began to gloat, saying that he could offer much more than a useless demon, and it seemed that they would never get along. Crow smiled, seeing how angry Marvas was, who was truly beside himself with rage. Walter, meanwhile, was shocked to see something like this, after which he asked if it was always so noisy in this house, and Puller advised him to remain silent at such moments, because that way he could live longer. The main character grabbed a sword hanging on the wall and handed it to Walter, saying that they had a whole month to prepare for war. The main character also said that his only requirement was that the guy demonstrate his talents during that month. Walter understood perfectly well that if his talents were not put to use, he would simply be removed from the plan. Leon confirmed the young man's words, saying that there was no point in having a vassal who would easily die on the battlefield. The young man firmly grasped the sword given to him by the main character, then declared with a confident look that he would do everything in his power to prove his usefulness. Walter asked if he would be able to fulfill Leon's wishes, if the chief would be able to grant his request. Without a moment's hesitation, the main character promised that he would definitely fulfill the young man's request. While Puller began to cough, drawing attention to himself, he started talking about how they should find a good teacher to determine the limits of the young man's strength. Demon also began to talk about how it was time for them to train, and Marvas said that Leon also needed to train in order to reach his full potential within that time frame. The main character decided to get started right away and began to leave. Some time later, it was evening on the street. Swords clashed together, creating a loud sound. It turned out to be Walter, who was training incredibly hard with his sword. It seemed like the guy was giving it his all in this training battle. While the main character's body was covered with a huge amount of aura, he was controlling one of the skeletons, after which several skeletons headed towards the guy, who was immediately ready to counterattack. A moment later, Walter moved from his spot and, with incredible dexterity, decapitated 2 skeletons in an instant. However, the guy got a little tired during training, after which he knelt before the hero, who silently looked at his vassal. Leon declared that from that moment on, the guy had earned a place among them, while the guy himself listened attentively to these words, after which a smile appeared on his face, because it had taken a lot of effort. A month passed, and the day of the battle arrived. A man rode out of the huge army on a horse and said he had a message for the head of the house. The Lord began to shout that he had given the main character a chance, and now a great deal of blood would be shed. The main character understood perfectly well that this would happen, while Puller was beside himself with rage, saying that their enemies had no concept of honor. The demon said that he could clearly see the fear in the eyes of their opponents and that they were very frightened. Puller did not understand Marva's words because in the end, their enemies had a huge numerical advantage over them. The demon began to say that this was not the case because in the end, they had exposed their plans. Puller assumed that the demon was referring to Kirchel, whose personality they had used for their own purposes. Puller assumed that if Kirchel were alive, their house would have immediately raised a white flag, and the fact that this had not happened could frighten the enemy. The demon declared that all mortals were fragile creatures by nature, saying that any change gave rise to a huge amount of doubt. Puller agreed, but added that even trembling hands could crush them with their numbers. The demon smiled, saying that the main character was capable of defeating even the full force of this army. The demon also said that people had nothing to worry about because in the end, their lord was many times stronger than they could imagine. The main character smiled silently as he listened to these words, while Puller didn't seem to doubt them at all. The demon smiled, anticipating the battle, thinking about how even he was impressed by the main character's absolute talent, which he had demonstrated. In the past, Leon had released a huge amount of energy, and there were crystals around him that even began to glow from its intensity. The demon smiled silently as he watched the young man, then made a movement and released an aura, causing a huge number of dead bodies to head straight for Leon. However, the main character didn't even open his eyes. He immediately summoned his warriors, and an incredible fight ensued, which ended with Leon's dead quickly defeating the demons. The demon understood perfectly well that the main character was summoning the simplest dead, but he was also amazed that only a week had passed since Leon began his journey, and he was already so skilled at controlling their bodies. The demon smiled, thinking that Leon's talent amazed even his imagination. Crow said that their lord was truly an incredible talent, even comparing him to an incredibly bright star. The demon said that the main character would surely one day drown the continent in blood and get absolutely everything he wanted. Crow said that Leon would even be able to get his favorite peanuts, while the demon said that Leon would most likely be able to obtain the most forbidden magic, which was capable of turning back time. The main character continued to sit with his eyes closed, then opened them and began to stand up. The demon smiled at Leon, seeming completely satisfied with the training process. The main character asked what kind of training they would do next. The corpses of the rebels lay on the ground, and Leon wondered what kind of training they would do next, but the demon suggested that they change locations first. Sometime later, already in the main character's house, the demon asked Leon how much he knew about dark magic. The main character did not rush to answer and stood silently for a while, then admitted that he knew the basics, as this had been taught in his family. The demon suggested that it was something similar to Kirchel's magic and ordered Leon to forget about this pathetic parody immediately. The main character, however, believed that in any case much depended on the individual, and he also said that it would be foolish to assume that his ancestor had conquered the entire continent using only corpses. He was sure that the founder had something else special. Crow began his transformation by saying that the main character was completely right, after which the monster snapped his fingers and began to talk about how necromancy was only part of dark magic, and that power was usually determined by magic reserves and skill. He then demonstrated the flame in his hand, which was black. Pullers began to praise their founder, while the demon preferred to remain on the sidelines, after which the demon confessed that he and the founder were true friends. Crow said that he was proud of the demon's loyalty, while the demon complained that Crow was so brave hiding behind the guise of the main character. Leon ordered them to stop the banter and wanted to move on to learning the spells the guys were talking about. The demon began to say that before the training could begin, the main character would have to fulfill a condition, and it seemed that Leon was not expecting something like this. The demon began to say that in order to fulfill the condition, Leon would have to take a risk and descend into his consciousness. It seemed that the guy did not fully understand the meaning of these words, but the demon confessed that the subconscious was a place that resembled a vessel where huge reserves of mana were hidden. The demon also said with a smile on his face that as soon as Leon could control this power, the whole war would seem like child's play to him. He also said that dark magic required enormous amounts of mana. Leon seemed to understand perfectly well that a lot of mana would be lost, but the demon added that the main character should not worry about that. The demon began to talk about how he could sense the terrifying reserves of mana hidden in Leon's subconscious, and also said that they might even be greater than those of their ancestor. The main character was glad to hear this, as he was already beginning to worry. The demon said that they could speed up the learning process, but that it would be dangerous for Leon's life. Leon seemed completely willing to take the risk and wanted to get started right away. The demon noticed that a light began to flicker in Leon's lifeless eyes again. The demon began to say that, to start with, Leon needed to exhaust his mana reserves to the limit, after which the main character immediately began to release his mana. The demon said that everything should work out on its own if the boy had enough talent, while Leon himself emitted a truly colossal amount of power. Looking at the incredible main character, the demon thought that simple greed for power could serve as incredible motivation, while Leon himself continued to increase the amount of mana he was releasing. Unexpectedly, the mana began to weaken, after which Leon assumed that this should be enough. But suddenly Leon began to fall to his feet, though Peller was able to catch his master. Peller began to cry and scream with all his might, fearing for his master's life, while the demon couldn't help himself and struck the man, telling him that he should trust his master more. It seemed that the man was still worried because even though the hero was the leader, he was still a child. Crow also began to say that Leon could turn out to be the most talented necromancer in history. The demon was even surprised that Crow began to speak sensibly. Marvas said that, given the young man's potential, he would easily overcome this trial and become stronger. Pullers cried and hoped with all his heart that Leon would succeed. Walter burst into the room, shouting that he had finally succeeded, saying that he had become a new master swordsman. Unexpectedly, the guy was shocked when he saw his master lying unconscious on the floor. Walter, like Puller in the past, began to cry and call out to Leon. However, he quickly calmed down, saying that he believed with all his heart that the head would overcome everything. The demon even wondered how such incredible talent had been hidden in the main character for so long. The guys sat silently near Leon, who was unconscious at that moment. The main character saw boundless darkness right in front of him, and the guy began to look around, then started moving in an unknown direction. Suddenly, the main character saw a ruined house with a man standing next to it. It turned out to be Leon's father, who greeted his son, saying that he believed the boy would arrive at this place. This instantly struck the usually cold-blooded main character, while his father smiled mysteriously, looking at his son. The main character's father suggested they take a walk, as they had a lot to discuss. Leon still couldn't believe that he was seeing his father, who seemed alive. The place around them was completely destroyed, and the main character and his father moved through this empty space. Leon silently followed the former head of the family, when suddenly the man stopped right on the steps. His father immediately assumed that since the boy had come to this place, he had decided to awaken his power. The main character admitted that everything was as the man thought, saying that he definitely hadn't come to this place just to chat. Leon also told him about his friends and subjects, for whom he was obliged to succeed in this endeavor. His father seemed pleased that the main character had someone in his life, but then he realized that he was just a figment of Leon's imagination, and his form was only a magical echo of the past. Leon didn't seem surprised by this information and was completely calm. His father said that it was all because he didn't have any innate potential, which was very unfair. His father said that it didn't matter now, because he could still be useful to Leon. He told him that in the end, he had been unable to enlist Marvas's support, and that he himself had been unable to cope with necromancy. It seemed that this had tormented him greatly in the past, and he said that Leon had now taken a completely different path. His father confessed that he had developed magic that allowed the main character to possess the powers of all his ancestors. However, Leon was currently only able to control a small amount of his powers, but the man was confident that his power would definitely help Leon in the future. The main character remembered his father's words that accepting someone else's mana as his own was incredibly dangerous. The hero remembered that doing so carried an incredible risk of losing control of the mana and facing the destruction of his own mind. His father said that the boy had listened to him very carefully, adding that foreign magic was marked by its owner and could not be taken by another mage. His father said that Leon was the only exception, saying that until the boy understood, he had to consider himself a blank slate. The main character really didn't understand what his father meant, while the man held Leon's hand and then said that their founder was the only person who possessed dark magic that was perfectly pure. His father began to create magic in his hands, which then turned into a sphere. The father confessed that the main character had also been blessed with the same gift as their founder. A moment later, the sphere grew many times larger, after which the space around it began to be drawn to it, and thus everything around it was rapidly destroyed while the father spoke about how Leon was himself, after which the space around them continued to rapidly destroy itself. Leon did not understand what was happening, while his father smiled sincerely, then placed his hand on his son's head. The man confessed that their meeting had come to an end, and the main character asked if they would meet again someday. The man promised that they would definitely meet again, because as a father, he had much to teach his son. The huge ball shrank in size and flew into his father's hands, after which he directed all this incredible energy towards the main character. Leon was instantly struck by the power of this energy. He had never felt anything like it in his life. The boy's body began to emit dark magic, which was like night, and the sphere penetrated Leon's body completely. The father confessed that the name of this amulet was greed, and it was capable of consuming everything in its path in an instant. The father then asked his son not to forget the name of the amulet, and Leon promised that he would never forget it. The space around them began to crumble, and the man confessed that he and his son would meet again when the boy's heart desired more. The main character bowed to the man, saying that he would hope with all his heart that this day would come as soon as possible. After that, the main character's father was left alone in this empty space. The father said that if fate so decreed, then he looked up at the sky, assuming that the hero would then be able to become a true rising star. The father regretted that he would not be able to see for himself what Leon would become, either the greatest man or someone who would fall into the depths of hell. The father sincerely hoped that everything would be fine for his son. In the present, all the boys looked at the main character, who had not yet regained consciousness after sinking into his subconscious. Polar was worried because a lot of time had passed and Leon had not woken up. It seemed that Polar was genuinely concerned about Leon's health, but the demon said that the main character simply could not fail this test, and the guy was also confident that the main character would easily overcome this test. Crow also seemed to have no doubts about Leon, after which the main character's body suddenly began to emit an enormous amount of power, which immediately attracted the attention of the others. The demons seemed to realize why Leon had been unconscious for so long. Walter did not understand what this incredible magical power was, because it was incredibly dense. The demon landed on the main character's body, then asked the guys to greet the Lord as they should. The demon then warned everyone that Leon would return a completely different person. Leon opened his eyes, and the guys waited silently for the guy to speak. He began to look at his people, then realized what was pressing on his chest. It was the demon that had been there. Sometime later, Walter was practicing with his sword. Later, the main character taught the boy how to control mana, and also personally trained the soldiers. Meanwhile, for days before the invasion, a huge army gathered in the streets of Silvert, fully armed. The Lord sat and surveyed his great army, completely ready for war. The Lord rose from his throne, saying that the time had come. He addressed all his valiant warriors, saying that very soon they would end the long history of the House of Marvas, after which he began to shout fiercely that together they would write a completely new history. The people were inspired, while the fake Kirchel stood still and did not react. It seemed that this evoked the most negative emotions in the fake. The raven sat in place, anticipating a battle where it could eat its fill, while the enemy army moved toward the main character's estate. The Lord thought about finding a weakness in the main character's poorly constructed soldiers, then thanked Kirchel for his excellent observation skills. The fake Kirchel flattered him, saying that it was the least he could offer in gratitude for the Lord's kindness. The Lord was also amazed that the Marvas family did not guard the graves of their ancestors at all, not understanding why. Kirchel assumed that the family was being cautious, because in the end, they did not want to destroy the graves of their ancestors. The Lord began to laugh, saying that the Marvas had completely lost their pride, and all they could do was remember their great ancestor. Kirchel fully supported the Lord's words, deliberately ingratiating himself with him. The Lord did not understand why the man did not answer immediately, assuming that he wanted to say something, but Kirchel began to say that he did not want to add anything at all and suggested continuing the march. After that, the troops continued their movement towards the estate. Suddenly, the Lord noticed something right in front of him. It seemed to be a small group of soldiers moving towards them. It turned out to be the main character with his people and soldiers. In the end, they stood directly in front of each other. Leon was glad that everything was exactly as they had agreed and that the Lord's word could be trusted. The Lord was amazed that he had come to see the fallen house and ended up being met by 100 soldiers. The enemy began to draw his sword, then instantly attacked Kirchel, assuming that this was a premeditated trap. Kirchel's head was severed from his body and began to fly towards the ground. Unexpectedly, the severed head began to speak, saying that only the main character had the right to stab him with a sword. The head began to emit a purple aura, which also began to appear at the place where the cut had been made. In the end, Kirchell's head returned to its place as if it had never been cut off at all. Kirchell admitted that such an experience was quite original, with a smile on his face, while the enemy could not comprehend what had just happened, because he was sure he had cut off the man's head. Kirchell moved toward the main character on horseback, while Lord began to shout that it didn't matter and that Kirchell would regret what he had done. The enemy was confident in his strength, as his army was several times larger than that of the main character. Suddenly, Leon began to speak, and with a crazy look on his face, he said that perhaps the Lord was very much mistaken. This instantly provoked the man, who began to get angry, while Leon began to unleash his powers, causing mana to fall directly onto the ground. The main character confidently declared that he had entered this battle just as confident in his victory. The ground began to change its appearance, and a moment later, skeletal soldiers began to rise from the ground. The enemy's mood instantly changed from anger to fear in the face of the power of necromancy. The main character was amazed at the Lord's observation, and then was equally surprised that the Lord was surprised that, fighting a necromancer, he did not expect to see the power of necromancy. The enemy stood on his horse in complete shock, instantly remembering his own words about what was most unjust, and how he had spoken of the power of the House of Marvas, who were able to resurrect the dead and force them to fight. He also remembered perfectly well the reason he had given, namely, an incredibly talented person who could change the balance of power with his own strength. In the present, Leon was filled with confidence in victory, while his monsters began to destroy the enemy soldiers at an incredible pace. The enemies tried to resist Leon's fierce counterattack, while the main character's army continued to arrive. One of the enemies thought that, in any case, their opponent was still a child who was definitely not ready for a war to the death. The enemy instantly moved towards the main character, but was suddenly stopped by Walter with his sword. They looked each other straight in the eyes, crossing their weapons. The enemy had to retreat a little because of the boy's strength. The enemy did not understand who had dared to stand before him, while the boy explained that his duty was to prevent anyone from approaching the main character. Walter began to smile at his opponent. The soldiers fought the undead to the death, while the Lord ordered his squad of mages to join the battle. After that, the mages began to prepare an attack together, and in the end, they struck the main character's army with an incredibly powerful beam. The skeletons began to take enormous damage from this magical attack, while the Lord turned to his knights on the front line and ordered them to attack the main character with all their might. For a while, the enemies even managed to seize the initiative, but the main character did not seem particularly concerned. The enemy was getting closer and closer to Leon, and the Lord, with a cruel expression on his face, declared that he himself was a merciless man, and began to talk about how many people he had to kill to achieve his position. The main character was surprised that the enemy really believed that he was interested in this family melodrama, while at the same time Leon seemed to be preparing his magic. The Lord began to shout that, in any case, a boy with a silver spoon in his mouth would never be able to reach his level. The enemy raised his sword, wondering if the main character was ultimately seeking revenge for his father's death. Without waiting for an answer, the Lord began to threaten that Leon would die on the battlefield anyway, unable to do anything. The main character's book appeared, after which Leon declared that his opponent was wrong about at least two things. Then he began to fill the book with magic, and it slowly began to glow purple. The main character stood and poured more and more magic into his book, then looked eerily at his opponent, who seemed nervous from the gaze. The main character, with a cold expression on his face, declared that he didn't care about revenge, adding that in any case, Lord would never have enough strength to defeat him. A few days before the battle in the military camp, the main character sat at a table with his subordinates and seemed to be fiercely discussing the battle plan they would soon have to carry out, while the demon licked his paw and said that in all his years he had seen tricks worse than this, but the one Leon had proposed was incredibly elaborate. The demon said that although the chosen location was excellent, everything else was bad, while Leon claimed that it was the best plan for their situation. The main character stated that if they made a mistake in their pursuit of caution, it would be foolish because the decision had already been made. Crow said that he sincerely believed in Leon's plan, after which Crow began to complain that the demon simply had no right to give advice. Walter also unquestioningly supported Leon's plan, although he clarified that this was not due to distrust of the demon, worrying that he might be misunderstood. The demon complained that no one cared about his opinion, and he said that the guys could do whatever they wanted. Polar promised that he would do everything in his power to immobilize as many troops as possible, because as a loyal vassal, he simply could not leave the main character alone on the battlefield. Leon began to get to his feet, saying that it was time to start carrying out the plan. Leon also asked Marvas for permission to ask him a question, after which the main character asked if the demon knew anything about the negative consequences of using the amulet, which turned out to be the very amulet that the guy's father had given him. The demon said he didn't know and suggested that it might be some kind of death. Marvas began to explain that the amulet contained a power akin to poison, as the main character was not yet able to withstand it. Leon remembered that the demon definitely wanted him to get the amulet, while Marvas said that it would be useful to them in the future. The demon said that the main character's strength should be enough for the upcoming battle, then said that the guy's potential was like a fruit that still needed to ripen. The main character silently looked at the demon, then Marvas started talking about how mortals can be loyal, but they have a lot of weaknesses. The demon began to tell him that the servants could unite against the main character at any moment, which is what happened to his father. Leon listened silently to these words and did not react at all, then replied something to the demon. In the present, the Book of Magic emitted a huge amount of mana, after which the main character seemed to be preparing something incredible. The guy's face was filled with confidence, while the enemy was amazed that the guy really believed that the Lord couldn't take his life. The main character's face changed instantly, which the enemy immediately noticed and tensed up. The main character's aura began to emanate from his body, and it was incredibly strong. The enemy couldn't believe his eyes, because the mana was the color of a black knight and was also incredibly pure dark magic. The enemy didn't understand how Leon was able to use this mana with such a level of control. The main character began to recite the spell, while the enemy understood perfectly well that something terrible was about to happen. The enemy felt with his whole body that he had to stop Leon, after which he ordered all his soldiers to do everything possible to stop the main character. Leon continued to recite his spell, and a moment later, a huge army of soldiers began to rise from the ground. The main character's new soldiers were ready for battle, and there were simply enormous numbers of them. At the same time, the enemy simply could not believe his own eyes. He saw before him a huge army of the dead. The demon watched the appearance of the huge number of soldiers, then complained that the main character was too much like his ancestor. Leon's amulet began to glow brightly, after which his soldiers began to shout, and a moment later they rushed into battle. And in just one moment, a single one of Leon's soldiers killed 3 of Lord's soldiers. The main character's army also had magicians who were preparing spells, after which even more people began to die on the battlefield. Lord realized that this was all a trap and that the main character had deliberately lured them to the cemetery. Lord understood perfectly well that Leon had an entire army of the dead under his command. Suddenly, the enemy noticed something interesting. The main character seemed to be getting tired very quickly. Leon grabbed his amulet and began coughing up his own blood. The Lord began shouting at the young man to stop, because he was risking his life, and he had promised to spare Leon and his subjects. The main character confessed that he would have to disappoint the enemy. In the past, the demon asked why Leon was willing to risk everything for some mortals. The demon held onto Leon's body and began to tell him that he would like Leon to refrain from taking risks and simply forget about people, while developing his incredible talent. Leon silently looked at the demon, then turned to Marvas, who turned to the young man with a smile on his face. The main character began to talk about how it was not necessary to wait for the fruit to ripen, because you could pick the fruit and leave it to ripen. In reality, the battlefield was in complete ruin. The enemy lord was breathing heavily, while the main character began to move towards him. It seemed that the enemy had lost all his strength for battle, while Leon stood confidently on his feet. The enemy seemed incredibly frightened as Leon looked at him with a contemptuous gaze. There were incredibly dark clouds in the sky, Heavy rain began to fall on the battlefield, and the main character stood over the enemy who had just lost the battle. The enemy remembered the boy's words that his goal was not revenge at all, and the main character admitted that it was the complete truth. The enemy reached out toward Leon, then began to beg him to spare his life, the man begging a child. The enemy promised that he would never again interfere with the main character's home, and also said that he would never reveal the boy's strength to anyone. The main character listened silently to his enemy's pleas, after which Leon was struck by the fact that Lord really believed that he could ask for mercy. The Lord began to shout that revenge would only lead to a greater cycle of revenge, and believed that Leon understood this perfectly well. Meanwhile, the main character looked at the Lord without showing any emotion. It seemed that at that very moment, the enemy realized that his life was about to end, and he began to shout that he had been forced to do what he did, and that the hero, as the head of his house, should understand this. He shouted that their duty was to do everything for the prosperity of their lands. The main character thought for a moment, saying that there was some truth in the Lord's words. The enemy got a glimmer of hope that he might be able to save his miserable life. The main character admitted that even so, he saw no reason to spare the Lord's life. It seemed that the enemy was not ready to hear such words, after which Leon explained that he would not kill the enemy for personal reasons, but because the Lord could no longer be of use to the House of Marvas. The main character said goodbye to Lord for the last time, who seemed to feel disgusting in the last seconds of his life, after which Lord began to shout that Leon was an arrogant creature and that he would definitely regret it. The main character interrupted this useless chatter with an incredibly accurate sword blow that cut off Lord's head. Leon stood completely emotionless, standing directly in front of the body of his recently slain enemy, after which he began to disperse his soldiers, and they began to disappear. It seemed that Leon himself was not feeling well either, after which he leaned to one side and eventually began to fall to the ground, having expended all his strength. Walter was worried about Leon and rushed to catch him, but the demon explained that they shouldn't worry, as the hero was simply suffering from mana depletion. The demon understood perfectly well that the boy's talent was on par with that of the founder, and he was also worried about whether Leon would be able to handle his incredible potential. The demon understood perfectly well that a monster raged inside Leon that even he was powerless to stop, and he thought that this was a risky deal. The demon suggested that they return to their business, after which something shiny was noticed on the Lord's body. Marvas realized that demons had begun to actively interfere in the human world, which was a very bad sign. It turned out that the mark of one of the demons was on the Lord's clothes. The guys rushed to the main character. Some time passed and Leon opened his eyes. Puller rejoiced that their master had finally awakened from his sleep. Puller began to beg to be thrown into a dungeon because he had let Leon down, but the demon said that no one would throw a man into a dungeon. Crow said that the cat was completely devoid of empathy, which again angered the demon. Leon said that there was no point in going to the dungeon, adding that Puller had done his job perfectly. Walter said that after Lord's death, their enemies would not think about attacking for some time. Puller said that thanks to the main character, their home would finally be able to get back on its feet. Puller admitted that they would most likely face a completely new problem. Leon asked what that problem was, to which Puller replied that he was ashamed to admit it. Then, with a grim expression on his face, he said that their house had been almost completely destroyed and they were in enormous debt. This seemed to shock Leon, who certainly did not expect to hear anything like that. The demon said that this was not a problem because they could simply demand reparations from the Sylvesters, but Puller confessed that the royal family had forbidden any demands for reparations for the main character's family. The demon did not understand why they were treated this way, and Puller explained that they and another house were dark magicians, which is why the emperor was trying to keep them under control. The main character listened to the information that the imperial family was unlikely to give them the opportunity to receive compensation in order to prevent their development. The demon complained that the country was in complete chaos, while Leona was interested in the amount of the debt. Puller held out his hand, showing the number 5 on his fingers, and the main character assumed that their debt amounted to 5,000. However, it was clear from Puller's face that this was not the case, which made the main character nervous and assume that the debt was 50,000. Puller remained with a sad expression on his face, while Leon believed that the amount could not be 500,000, as it would be practically impossible to pay off. Polar admitted that, unfortunately, Leon was completely right, after which he said that their debt was 500,000, which instantly made Leon realize that they were in deep trouble. At that moment, an unknown man arrived on the main character's land, who turned out to be an envoy from the Tower of Magicians. A girl greeted Richard, saying she was glad to see him. It turned out to be Carlin, who was the head of a criminal organization. Richard began to say that he was sure that his tower's debt to the girl's organization had been completely paid off. But Carlin calmed the man down, saying that she had not come for him, because her debtor was someone else. Richard confessed that he still hadn't recovered from his interactions with the debt collectors. The girl winked, saying that they strongly recommend that all their clients read the document carefully, even the small print. Richard turned around, saying that it was time to stop talking. He started walking, assuming that they were looking for the same person. Polar admitted in front of everyone that their total debt was 500,000, after which the man's face became very sad, and the hero was shocked to learn how large the debt was. Suddenly, someone started knocking on the door. The man and his friends instantly looked toward the door. Polar headed there to open it, while the main character began to feel uneasy. The demon immediately noticed this, but Leon did not admit that he felt uneasy. Polar admitted that some guests had arrived, and the main character asked how many guests had arrived. The man said that there were only 2 people, a man and a woman. Leon seemed to feel that this was not good. A little later, tea was served, and the man grabbed a cup, then thanked the main character for his hospitality, and the girl introduced herself, saying that she belonged to an organization of sleepers. The main character sat silently in front of them for a while, then said that he was glad to welcome them to his territory. The man smiled at Leon, and the girl smiled mysteriously as well. Walter was worried because each of them posed a threat, and Crow admitted that their master was much stronger than he appeared, and that they shouldn't worry about him. The girl said that rumors had reached them that Leon had won a territorial war. With a smile on her face, she congratulated the main character, hoping that the trophies from the victory would be enough to pay off the debt. The main character asked how much they owed to the Carlin organization. Polar confessed to the main character that Carlin was responsible for most of their debt. The main character understood perfectly well that the girl was the head of one of the largest criminal gangs in the world, and he also remembered that if the debt was not paid, the girl would sell people to black magicians for experiments. Carlin was amazed that Leon was familiar with the intricacies of their work, saying that she could get straight down to business. The main character repeated his words that he wanted to hear the exact amount he had to pay. The girl looked at the guy, then reached for a piece of paper, saying that for starters, they would insist on immediate payment of 10% of the total debt. The girl put the paper on the table, reminding him of the interest rate of 30% per annum, after which she recommended Leon to pay the debt as soon as possible with a terrifying look. The main character understood perfectly well that, with such an interest rate, he would never be able to pay off this debt, after which he wondered aloud what kind of fool could have signed such a reckless contract. Polars confessed that the person who had done this was the main character's father, and Leon thought about how many problems his own father had caused him. Richard asked the girl not to be so strict and to give Leon at least some time to enjoy his victory. The man said that it was unlikely that the hero had such a huge amount of money, after which the girl began to look completely insane and said that Richard had no right to interfere in business negotiations. She struck the guys with her words that careless words could accidentally cost too much. The man began to get to his feet, saying that he understood Carlin's words perfectly, then started to leave, saying that he would return as soon as the guys had finished their negotiations. The main character looked silently at the girl, trying to say that he had no money, but the girl warned him that he should think twice before saying such things to a guy. The girl confessed that she had heard similar words from Leon's father too many times. The main character even thought about quietly killing the girl, but the demon immediately warned him not to even think about it. The demon said that the girl was the kind of person who could destroy Leon in an instant. The guy silently looked at the girl, already dismissing such thoughts. Crow began to express his disappointment in Leon, because at this rate they would be left with nothing. Polar said that Leon's father had acted with the best of intentions, and Walter was confident at the time that they would be able to find a way out of this situation. The main character sat and said nothing, then began to speak to the girl. Leon began to beg Carlin to have mercy on them, showing no emotion whatsoever. It seemed that the girl did not expect to hear this, and the main character's allies were shocked to hear such words. Walter couldn't even believe that Leon had actually said those words. At that time, in the hallway of Leon's house, a man was looking at the founder of the house, Marvas. He looked at the majestic portrait, thinking that such a journey was worth it to see this great man. Suddenly, he remembered the moment when he first saw the main character, the magician's eyes clearly seeing the incredible amount of mana that Leon possessed. The man walked down the hallway thinking about what incredible power the main character possessed. With a smile on his face, he thought that if he could get Leon into his tower, it would be a huge stroke of luck for them. Richard leaned against the wall, thinking about how he could win Leon's favor. Then he began to release magic from his hand, after which a ball of magic appeared around his body, and then he took out a strange object and began to stare at it intently. It turned out to be a subordinate of the head who begged the man not to disappear so suddenly. Richard said he would explain everything later, then said he had important information, which seemed to give the old man no hope. Richard asked how many gold coins they had, and it seemed the mage understood that things were not going well. The girl was struck by Leon's words, saying that her gang should not be perceived as a gang of thugs. The girl instantly began to create a small flame at the tips of her fingers, then incredibly quickly destroyed the glass that was right in front of Leon. The girl said with a scary look that they were more careful than Leon could imagine. Walter couldn't hold back and grabbed his sword, yelling that the girl had no right to threaten his master. Carlin admitted that only those who didn't pay back their loans could make them angry. The girl asked if she had made herself clear enough to be understood. The main character admitted that they had no gold at all. The girl did not seem to understand the main character's words until Leon admitted that all their reserves were completely empty. The girl froze in place for a moment. Then she began to realize why Leon was so afraid, after which she began to release a huge amount of fiery aura, promising to show the main character what happens to those who do not pay their bills. Leon seemed a little frightened by the power the girl had demonstrated, while a mage burst into the room and shouted for Carlin to stop. In the end, the guys really froze in place for a while Richard seemed happy that he had managed to intervene in time. The mage shouted that the girl had no right to destroy the future of their tower. The main character seemed completely unprepared to hear such words. Even Walter was shocked to hear something like that. He instantly assumed that Leon simply had an incredible plan, and everything was going strictly according to it. The main character asked what a hermit was, while the girl still looked enraged. The man stood between the main character and Carlin, after which the girl began to weaken her power and sighed. Leon still didn't understand what was happening, after which the main character asked all his people to leave, because the questions needed to be discussed in private. Sometime later, the hero clarified whether it was true that if he joined the hermit, they would pay 10% of his debt. The main character asked if he had understood Richard correctly, and the man admitted that everything was absolutely true. The man began to put the cup on the table, then suggested that Leon had definitely used necromancy in the recent war against the Sylvesters. The main character asked how the mage had come to that conclusion, and he immediately replied that otherwise they would never have been able to win the war. The man also said that the girl understood this perfectly well, since she had come to this place herself. The girl was amazed at how observant the mages were. The girl confessed that she really believed that the current head of Marvas had gained the power of his family, and that was why she decided to come hunting. The main character asked if the girl really thought they were already able to pay off the debt, at which point she admitted that she had indeed had such thoughts. The girl also confessed that she didn't really believe that Leon would be able to pay off the debt right away. The demon thought that the girl was a real devil. The main character summed up the situation, saying that the mage wanted to hire him, and the girl wanted to get her money. Leon also couldn't understand why the guys were so sure that he had gained the power of a necromancer. The girl said that other methods that could help in battle would cost too much money. The man said that he would never believe that such a war could be won with money. Richard admitted that this was exactly why he immediately thought of the power of necromancy. The main character silently looked at the people, and the girl said that it would be beneficial for her to get close to someone who was not yet recognized but would one day be the greatest genius on the continent. Leon suggested that the debt would not go away, after which the girl said that this was natural, and then began to reach into her pocket, saying that loan sharks were not clowns. She took out a firearm and pointed it directly at the main character. Richard began to ask the girl to leave for a while, because he wanted to talk to Leon alone. The girl decided to do so and reminded him that collecting debts had always been a priority for her. The girl began to leave the main character's room, after which the magician admitted that they had miraculously managed to get out of the situation. The main character confessed that he did not trust the man at all, and looking at him, Leon could clearly sense that Richard was not human. Richard began to smile, then pointed at Leon and said that the same could be said about him. It turned out that Richard could see the demon perfectly well and said that Leon had confused him with one of the 72 minions of hell. The demon was amazed that he had met a magician capable of seeing him without any contracts, after which Marva's appearance began to change, and he asked with an incredibly serious look who Richard really was. Richard was instantly covered in an aura and gradually began to change his appearance. Richard was completely transformed and looked completely different, while emitting a terrifying amount of magic. The demon was amazed to see a living dragon, as he had assumed that they had all died in the war against magic. The main character also couldn't believe that Richard was a dragon, while the mage himself didn't understand why a demon would associate with humans. The mage also assumed that the reasons might be related to the first head of this house. Leon asked the dragon not to worry, saying that Marvas was on the side of humanity and would not cause any harm. Marvas confirmed Leon's words, saying that he was different from other demons. The dragon said that in this situation, the guys had no reason to interfere in human affairs, after which Leon asked permission to inquire, and, not waiting for an answer, asked what exactly was required of him. The dragon confessed that their school was for recluses, explaining that everyone was paid for membership, and the condition was a desire to become a magician. The guys didn't believe that those were all the conditions and ordered the dragon to tell them everything as it was. The dragon admitted that the guys were completely right and added that he was going to tell them anyway. The head told them that the main condition was that they could not join other schools for any amount of money. The main character looked intently at Richard. The demon assumed that this condition was created to suppress competitors, but the dragon admitted that this was one of the reasons, but the main one was different. The demon placed the badge of one of the demons on the table and said that there were 2 other schools besides theirs, one of which was completely subordinate to the demons. Marvas instantly realized that his fellow demons were up to something very bad. The demon asked what his kin were ultimately trying to achieve, and the mage sat silently for a while, then said that the demons and their people wanted to resurrect the demon king himself, named Baal. Many thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Thank you very much. If you liked it, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I will continue to try to entertain you with good content.